Good morning, everyone. A good evening for some people from the States. Thank you very much for joining us today, especially given the fact this is Friday morning in South Korea. I should express my utmost gratitude. I welcome you to our KU Global Lecture Series focusing on data in the era of digital transformation. Today is the opening day of the program composed of 4 different lectures. We have 288 people registered already, not only from Korea University, but also 40 other universities and institutes around the world, which is very exciting. I hope that you will leave this program at the end not reassured, but restless, eager to do battle with data and do cultivate an ever richer harvest of insights from data analytics. It is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor Legewie. Professor Joscha Legewie is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Harvard University. Professor Legewie received his PhD in sociology from Columbia University. Before joining Harvard Sociology, he was an assistant professor at New York University and Yale University. His research focuses on social inequality, education, and quantitative method and urban sociology. He is especially interested in understanding social processes and patterns of social organization that lead to inequality related to race, ethnicity, gender, and socioeconomic status. He is a recipient of numerous awards. I cannot even list all of them, and including ASA Outstanding Article Award. And in 2019, he was selected as the best sociologist under 40. I'm very impressed. And some of you may have noticed that we did our PhD together at Columbia. And I'm not shy about telling you that Professor Legewie was the superstar in our cohort. And I look very much forward to what he will tell us today about his current research. After his talk, our own professor, Professor Song, will open up for discussion. Please join me in welcoming Professor Legewie.
Thank you so much for having me. It is really a pleasure to join you all. I wish I could be there in person, but we have to postpone that to the next time. But it's really exciting to share some of my recent and ongoing research with you all and tell you about the role that that data and that big data has played for me in conducting this research. I'll go ahead and you should be able to see my slides now.
Yes.
My talk today is about the enduring impact of New York City's stop, question, and frisk policy. And I'll talk about some lessons that we have learned from the use of large-scale administrative or also big data, from the effect of these programs on various aspects, both on crime, but also on various social outcomes, particularly in terms of education. I'm still trying to, I think that looks better, no? Okay. Over the last decades, law enforcement underwent kind of a fundamental transition away from a prioritization of felony offenses towards kind of a relentless targeting of minor offenses, misdemeanors, and violations. And one of the most prominent programs in this kind of change in policing in the United States was the so-called Stop, Question, and Frisk program in New York City that has attracted a lot of attention, partly because there was large-scale administrative data that allowed both researchers but also journalists to kind of dig into the data, look at different patterns, and in that sense, the data has really helped to accelerate both research but also public discourse on New York City's Stop, Question, and Frisk program. And today I'll talk a little about the enduring impact of this program on minority youth and what we have learned from this program over the last decade of research. Some of this work, I'll mainly focus on my own work, but also point at some other research that has really helped us to understand the effects of this program in better ways and what this kind of large-scale administrative data has taught us about the effects of this particular policing program. So before I get more into the details, I just want to clarify what we're talking about here. the Stop, Question, and Frisk program is the practice of temporarily detaining, questioning, and searching civilians on the street for weapons, contraband, and other reasons. They are also often called Terry stops in the United States. So this is when a police officer stops somebody on the street, asks them questions, in some cases searches them, which is the frisk component. But in other cases, just ask a number of questions. A large number of these police stops involve some very mild form of police force. I'll show you some descriptive characteristics later, but that's the general idea of the Stop, Question, and Frisk program. It is part of proactive broken window policing programs that have kind of the idea to proactively engage citizens even before crime happens and prevent imminent criminal activity. There are certain legal regulations that are guiding a Stop, Question, and Frisk operations. I'm not going to talk about the details here, but there are both state and federal regulations that guide under which conditions police officers can stop a civilian on the street. And very importantly, these Stop, Question, and Frisk operations are very well documented on what's called the UF 250 form. So starting roughly in 2004, the NYPD started to systematically document these Stop, Question, and Frisk operations, and over the years accumulated records of millions of police-citizens interactions that for the first time give us the ability to study the consequences of these type of interactions with the police, and have thereby facilitated both research and the public discourse on this particular program, but also policing more broadly. So here's the number of Stop and Frisk operations between 2002 and 2019. You can see that the program increased in popularity kind of rapidly over the 2000s and reached a peak in 2011 with well over 650,000 police stops in a single year in New York City. And then it rapidly declined as part of kind of a public backlash against the program, a lawsuit that was filed against the NYPD that alleged discriminatory practices. And then also as part of the transition of administration from what used to be the Bloomberg administration to the de Blasio administration, that's changed very much course in the use of the Stop, Question, and Frisk program, so that the number of Stop, Question, and Frisk operations today are still are on a very low level, although there's general agreement that these numbers are somewhat underreported. But importantly, I think this program is not only an important example, or maybe the most prominent example of these kind of Stop, Question, and Frisk programs, program in the area of proactive policing, but it's also kind of, for us as social scientists, a laboratory to study the effects and consequences of policing, because we have access to this very detailed data on police stops across New York City over an extended period of time. So I'll talk about 4 key findings today. The first is disparities in exposure to Stop, Question, and Frisk are huge. The second is that racial bias in policing explains some of these disparities in exposure, but not all. Stop, Question, and Frisk maybe reduced crime. And finally, the part that most of my own research has focused on, the hidden costs of policing programs like Stop, Question, and Frisk, which are potential negative consequences for the education and health of minority youth. And this work is in collaboration with a number of researchers. Most are PhD students here at Harvard that have all helped to make this work possible in various ways, and I'll acknowledge them whenever I talk about components of this project that involves other researchers who have greatly contributed to this work. And it also builds on kind of assembling a data infrastructure that brings together information from different government agencies and makes it possible to study the effects of this program on various outcomes. And most importantly, of course, there's data coming from the New York City Police Department that include both crime complaints. These are crime that is either observed by citizens or reported by police officers themselves. These are geocoded, incident level geocoded records that tell us when and where, what kind of crime happens well over a decade across New York City. The second component are arrests. And the final component are pedestrian stops as part of the Stop, Question, and Frisk program. These are all incident level records that are geocoded, so we can track both policing and crime across New York City well over a decade in a very fine-grained, both spatial and temporal resolution. The second component comes from the New York Department of Education. The New York Department of Education is the largest school district in the United States with well over 1 million students that are enrolled in New York City public schools every single year. And we can track them starting in 1994, but for many relevant factors only starting around 2000. We can track how these students do in school, how they're performing on tests, whether they're taking part of certain services offered by the school. Students started filling out a survey in 2007. So this kind of information gives us a lot of detail about how well students do in school, how their test scores are developing over time, where they live, where they go to school, who their classmates are. And we are able to combine this information with records from the New York Police Department on the neighborhood level so that we can track the exposure of students to policing across neighborhoods in New York City. And the final component that we're just beginning to work with is New York State Medicaid data that also allows us to look at health outcomes in addition to educational outcomes. But it's very early work, and you're not going to see any findings here today. And all this is linked on the neighborhood level. So whenever I'm talking about exposure to policing, I'm talking about exposure to policing in and around your neighborhood, either where you live or where you go to school. So let me start by talking about the first key finding here, which is that disparities in exposure to Stop, Question, and Frisk are huge. This is in no way a new finding, but I'm trying to break it down in new ways that gives us kind of new insights about who the people are who are most exposed to this program, and gives us new ways to look at exposure to this particular policing program in New York City. So what you see here on the x-axis is the age of people who are stopped by the police. On the y-axis, you see the rate of police stops per 1,000 residents in a particular age category. And here's the distribution for Black men for the time period of 2006 to 2012, which is kind of the peak of Stop, Question, and Frisk in New York City. And when you look at 18, 19, 20-year-old Black men in New York City, there were roughly 1,000 police stops per 1,000 residents in 1 year. So that can either mean that every single person is stopped one time, or it means a single person in this group is stopped 1,000 times. So we don't know whether people are stopped repeatedly, but it's an incredibly high number of police stops for this particular age group of Black men. And you can also see that this frequency of stops starts to rapidly increase around age 14, 15. There are already over 250 police stops per 1,000 15-year-old Black men in New York City. 16, 17, and then 18, 19, 20, we are roughly at 1,000 stops per 1,000 residents, and then it declines as people get older. Here's a comparison to white men. The stop rates are substantially lower compared to Black men, and Hispanic men are sometime in between here. Asian men, which are not on the slides here, look very similar to white men in terms of the rate of police stops per 1,000 residents. The rates for women are generally substantially lower. but there's still differences across racial and ethnic group, which you see here on the bottom when you compare the rate between Black women, Hispanic women, and white women. But you can immediately see the huge disparities both across race, gender, and age, and the stop rate for each of these groups, population groups. But this, of course, entirely ignores the geographic component of this. The rate of police stops is substantially higher in some areas of New York City. And in some areas, there are about 1,000 stops per 1,000 residents, ignoring the demographic component. So when you now start to think about 20-year-old Black men who live in somewhere in central Harlem, which is kind of the darker area above Central Park, the large white area in Manhattan, they're extremely frequently exposed to policing. A large percentage of these stops also involve the use of police force. In some areas, as much as 50% of police stops involve some use of police force. This is generally called hands-on suspect. And then there are also more severe forms of use of police force, but the experience of a police stop where an officer just asks you a question, or where an officer actually touches you and it involves hands-on suspect, is substantially different, and the rates of use of force in some areas is extremely high. So when we think about here, this is Central Harlem, a neighborhood like Central Harlem, there are about 800 stops per 1,000 residents, and about 40% involve the use of police force. Then another question is how this exposure differs across cohort. And to answer this question, I'll return to the statistic of the number of stops per 1,000 residents. In this case, it's colored, so red colors indicates up to 1,300 stops per 1,000 residents, and blue indicates 0. On the x-axis here, we have the year, and on the y-axis, we have age. Early, at the beginning of stop, question, and frisk, the rates were still not as high as in later years, but they rapidly increased to the peak 2011, where we have a distribution where you can see that Black men aged around 20 are stopped at extremely high rates compared to other age groups. And then it rapidly declines over the following years, and now we can look at how certain cohorts grow up over this time, over this implementation of stop, question, and frisk. So this is the 2004 middle school cohort that grew up right at the peak of the stop, question, and frisk policy, compared to the 2010 middle school cohort, which grew up at a later point in time and therefore was not exposed to the same level of policing. And some of our research traces 5 cohorts of middle school students to see how their experience with policing differs and what kind of effects it has on educational outcomes. And finally, as kind of a last component of this description of racial, ethnic, gender, cohort, and geographic differences in exposure to policing, I want to focus on the question of what is the proportion of people who have been stopped by the police. In many ways, this is a more interesting question than the rate of police stops, but we just don't have the same type of data. We cannot break it down in the same kind of detail as the figures I showed you before. So this is research coming from Amanda Geller using the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing study. That is one of the better surveys that ask about exposure to policing. And in this survey, Black kids around 15 years of age, about 40% say that have been stopped by the police, compared to 23% of white youth. And 50% of Black youth report that they were scared during this stop, compared to 25% of white youth. Importantly, this doesn't only focus, or this survey doesn't only focus on New York City, it's across major metropolitan areas in New York City, in the US. when you actually look at the data just for New York City, we have a relatively small sample, but the proportion of Black youth who report that they were stopped by the police is substantially higher than the 40% reported across major metropolitan areas in the United States. So extremely high rates of exposure to policing at a very young age, with huge disparities across racial ethnic groups, across age, across gender, across different neighborhoods in New York City. And importantly also, this is pretty much undisputed, but I think the kind of ways in which we try to break down the data offers new insights and who is particularly exposed, and it helps us get a better understanding of who might be affected by this policy. I'll turn to the second component here, which is about racial bias in policing explains some of these disparities in exposure. It's not really the focus of my own research. I've been doing some work on this with 2 PhD students here who do the police stop empirical tests on racial bias in pedestrian stops. I'm not really going to get into the details here, but I really think it's an important component of our understanding of stop, question, and frisk and kind of proactive policing programs more broadly. I think over time, researchers have become increasingly aware of how challenging it is to estimate and kind of determine the extent of racial bias in policing programs like stop, question, and frisk. But it's mostly undisputed that racial bias plays some role in explaining disparities, but there's a lot of controversy about how much of these disparities can be explained by racial bias and how much can be explained by differences in criminal involvement, higher rates of criminal involvement across certain age groups, across certain racial groups. And then the second important point that I want to make here is that all of this research essentially focuses on officer bias and not kind of structural discrimination, structural racism. So it's always focused on kind of a counterfactual approach to causality and the question of would an officer have behaved differently if the color of the skin of the person they stopped was different. That's kind of the focus of most of the quantitative work, but it's not about the assignment of policing resources and other kind of structural processes that might explain differences in exposure across racial group, and instead very narrowly focused on this question about officer bias. And anyone who's interested in reading more about this, an excellent article by Isa Kohler-Hausman from 2019 makes this argument very convincingly. So kind of the next part that I would like to talk about are the consequences of exposure to policing, both in terms of crime, but also kind of the hidden social costs in relation to educational outcomes. So the first point is about the effect of policing on crime, and I'll talk a little about findings from our own study in collaboration with Jeffrey Fagan, Aggressive Policing and the Educational Performance of Minority Youth. And this work focuses on a program called Operation Impact that was implemented between 2003 and 2012, which is a broken window proactive policing program with kind of a focus on the strict enforcement of low-level crimes and an extensive use of pedestrian stops, which are stop, question, and frisk operations in New York City that have generally the goal kind of to prevent criminal activity even before it happens. So the proactive engagement of citizens on the street, even without or before observing any criminal activity. The Operation Impact essentially designated certain areas in the city as so-called impact zones, and then flooded these areas with additional police officers. And then roughly every 6 months, they changed things around and designated other areas as impact zones, moved officers to these areas, and flooded them with additional police officers, substantially increased pedestrian stops. So here you see an example of Operation Impact in its fourth iteration. It was implemented between January and July 2005, and then roughly every 6 months, they changed things around and designated slightly different areas as so-called impact zones. And I'm using a difference in difference approach here to estimate the effect of this program, both on crime and later educational outcomes. I'm not going to get into the technical details here, but the essential idea is a comparison of changes in crime before, during, and after Operation Impact for both treatment areas, so areas that were designated as impact zones, and control areas, some other areas that we think might be comparable. So we are comparing the trend in crime rates across areas that are designated and are part of the program compared to areas that we consider good control areas. And let's first look at what happened to policing activity when areas were designated as impact zones. So what you see here on the x-axis are the quarters, 4 quarters prior to an area being designated as impact zone. Then the kind of shaded in gray, you see what happens when areas are designated as impact zones. And then we have 4 quarters afterwards, which shows us what happens after they're removed from the program. And here on the y-axis, you have our estimates in terms of change in crime. So a value of 0 essentially indicates that our treatment and control areas look exactly the same. So before areas are designated as crime, as impact zones, they look very similar in terms of the number of pedestrian stops. Both the areas that are designated as impact zones at a later point in time and our control areas have very similar level of policing. Once areas are designated as impact zones, there's a substantial increase in the number of pedestrian stops, which is exactly what the program was designed to do. It was designed to flood these areas with additional police officers who were supposed to engage in these pedestrian stops, who were supposed to do other things. And once areas are removed from the program, we observe a decline in pedestrian stops and a return to previous level, so that the treatment control areas look similar after they're removed from the program again. And this reflects roughly a 35% increase in the use of stop, question, and frisk operations in areas designated as impact zones. Very little change in felony arrests. Felony arrests are arrests for major offenses. So if somebody robs a bank or a gas station, they were arrested before and they are arrested when areas are designated as impact zones. So these are serious offenses. The NYPD was already enforcing them before areas were designated as impact zones. We don't see any change in the number of arrests related to these serious offenses when areas are become part of this program. We do see a change in misdemeanor arrests. These are arrests for minor things. Drug possession on the street is one of the most prominent, or generally kind of drug-related offenses are some of the most prominent misdemeanor arrests. And finally, a substantial increase in violation arrests, which are again low-level offenses. These are arrests that usually shouldn't even happen, related to a traffic ticket or something like that. So we do observe a substantial increase in pedestrian stops. We do observe a substantial increase in low-level arrests, and these are exactly the type of things this proactive window policing program was about. So now let's look at what happens with crime when areas are designated as impact zones. So the first thing you can see here is that the number of violent crimes was substantially higher in the 6 months before areas were designated as impact zones. And this was part of the program. This was one of the criteria the NYPD used to select areas as impact zones is exactly what the NYPD told us about the ways in which they selected areas to be part of the Operation Impact program. Once they are designated as impact zones, we do observe a drop in the number of crime that is modest or even substantial, particularly when you consider the higher level of violent crimes before areas are designated as impact zones. However, we see very little change in property crime. So what we see here is substantial increase in policing, potential negative effect on crime of this program, and I'm describing my finding here as maybe reduced crime because there are some. This is still disputed. Some of our other analyses don't really show the same patterns. There's some other research out there that says stop, question, and frisk. Police stops had little effect on crime. So I think this is still an active area of research. Our own findings here show a modest negative effect on crime, but there's other evidence. Some of our own other analyses do not necessarily confirm this. So I think it's really important to kind of reflect on what is the stage of current research on this question, focusing on the enduring impact of the Stop, Question, and Frisk program. Now I'll turn to what I call the hidden costs of these policing programs and the potential negative consequences of Stop, Question, and Frisk on education and health of minority youth, which is what a lot of my own research has focused on over the last years. So there's a potential negative effect based on reduced trust in state institutions, system avoidance, stress, and changing community life. That has been documented a lot of ethnographic studies over the last decades, going back to this is a book by Eli Anderson, a famous professor at Yale University, called Streetwise, published at the beginning of the 1990s. And he describes the ways in which mainly men of color navigate constant exposure to police officers and what it kind of does with their life. And there are a number of other ethnographic studies that similarly document the ways in which exposure to policing has an impact on mainly young men of color, but also families. And I think this ethnographic work is really essential in motivating my own work that tries to build on these large-scale administrative data sources to study and examine the potential effects of policing on educational outcomes. And one of the key mechanisms here, I think, focus on reduced trust in state institutions that kind of bleeds over from the criminal justice system to schools and potentially other state institutions as part of exposure to policing and other kind of systems of social control and surveillance. And the second really important mechanism here is that police contact has potentially negative health consequences such as stress, fear, trauma. That have been documented in an increasing number of studies over the last years that look at these health effects using different surveys, using different methods, and that kind of consistently show potentially negative effects on certain health outcomes of exposure to policing, both on the neighborhood level and in personal interactions with the police. And these potential negative effects on health then have consequences for educational outcomes as well. So again, the findings I'm going to show you draw from the study with Jeffrey Fagan, Aggressive Policing and the Educational Performance of Minority Youth, that focuses on this NYPD policing program called Operation Impact. We are using here again a difference approach. In this case, focusing on African American and Hispanic students in grade 3 through 8 that are aged, this is, I believe, 10 to 15, from 2000 to 2012. And the results I'm showing you here are going to focus on what's called English Learning Arts test scores. So these are essentially English test scores. The results for mathematic test scores look relatively similar. And the key independent variable is the length of exposure to impact zones scaled to 1 year. So 1 unit change indicates you're exposed to operation impact for an entire year in your residential census tract, which is a very small scale neighborhood in which you live in New York City. So we already learned that Operation Impact substantially increased police activity in terms of pedestrian stops and arrests for low-level offenses. We already learned that Operation Impact potentially lowered crime. And now the question is, what are the effects on educational outcomes for 13 to 15-year-old Black boys? And what you see here on the bottom are the 2 years prior to the home census tract of a student being designated as an impact zone, and then 2 years afterwards. In this case, I'm focusing on yearly outcome data because test scores are only observed every year, not every quarter, like the crime data and the police data. And on the y-axis, again, we have the standardized effect size, exposure to Operation Impact. And in the 2 years before areas are designated as impact zones, the test scores are very similar between our control areas and our treatment areas, so areas that are designated as impact zones. Once areas are designated as impact zones, we observe a substantially lower reading test scores, and that effect kind of returns to the previous level once areas are removed over this program, although it takes roughly 2 years after the test scores in these areas return to the same level as before. And these findings are consistent across different model specifications. Happy to talk about the technical aspect here in more detail if there are any questions about that. Importantly, these effects are pretty much confined to older African-American boys. So here you see this main effect I just showed you. So the effect for the area highlighted in gray here, when areas are designated as impact zones across age. You can see that the effect is essentially 0 for 9-year-old students, but then substantially higher for 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old Black boys. It is also confined to African-American boys, both Hispanic boys and African-American and Hispanic girls do not experience this negative effect of exposure to the stop, question, and frisk program. So this is the group, as I showed you earlier, this is the group that is also most frequently exposed to police officers already at a very high level at around age 15. So the key summary here is that aggressive policing can lower the educational performance of African-American youth. Importantly, there's now a number of other studies that have looked at similar patterns. I'm just going to highlight one here from 2 PhD students. The social cost of proactive policing, the impact of New York City Stop, Question, and Frisk program on educational attainment, that focuses on New York City as well, but uses entirely different methods. Focus on high school students that are slightly older and observes very similar patterns in terms of how the effect differs across racial and ethnic groups and across gender, which is very encouraging considering that the study is based on a very different design. So it makes me more confident in the potentially negative effects of exposure to these policing programs on students of color. Now I would like to spend some time talking about what I see as key challenges in this research that examines the social consequences and cost of policing. Key challenges for this work over the next decade of research that looks at the effect of the hidden costs of policing programs. And one of the key challenge I think remains to be the question of causality. So are these effects actual effects of the programs, or are they driven by some other underlying factors such as crime? Policing is generally closely related to crime and certain other neighborhood characteristics. So maybe these other characteristics are actually driving the effects. So that causality remains a huge challenge. We are doing some ongoing work using different estimation strategies with a PhD student here in the econ department. But generally, I think not a single study will be able to answer this question conclusively, but instead kind of accumulating evidence from using different approaches from different settings that consistently show the same findings make me more confident about the causal nature of these effects. And importantly, this work really essentially relies on building these kind of infrastructure, the large-scale data sets that allow us to study these effects across different settings. It's also hugely important to study, get a better understanding of the mechanisms. I think in many ways, our understanding here is mainly shaped by a series of ethnographic studies that have looked at the effects of policing on minority youth. We also starting to do some work that uses the health data that I highlighted at the beginning. So bringing in other kind of large-scale administrative data sources that allow us to look at the potential health effects of these policing programs really helps us to get a better understanding of the underlying mechanisms. A third component is that we have to focus more on the type of contact with the criminal justice system. So the work I talked about here today mainly focuses on neighborhood level exposure to policing programs, but there are other types of contact. What does it mean if you're stopped by a police officer yourself? What does it mean to be arrested? So what are the effects of these different types of police contact on educational outcomes and on health outcomes? We have to get a much better understanding of the role of the type of policing program, and also in the US, increasingly important alternative models of public safety, and how the effect of things like community policing or other programs that are designed to reduce crime rates but do not necessarily rely on policing in the same way. How do they affect both crime, and how do they have potential spillover effects on educational and health outcomes? Is really important as we kind of think about the policy implications of this type of work. And we are in the process of conducting a national study focused on what's called the COPS program. It was a federal program designed to hire police officers across the United States, with a PhD student here in our department, that kind of tries to get a much broader understanding of the effects of different types of policing on educational outcomes, not just focus on New York City, which is kind of a great laboratory where we have all the data we can dream of in place. But on the other hand, it's only one city in a very big world, and we want to know whether these kind of effects also apply in other settings, and what is about other policing programs. It's really important to think about fade out. So do the effects we observe in 15-year-old students, do they persist? Does it have negative consequences for long-term outcomes, such as high school graduation? So we have some ongoing work with a number of PhD students here, Nefara, Nino, and John, that looks at high school graduation, college enrollment, and other long-term outcomes, and tries to understand the kind of longer-term effects of these programs. And kind of one component that I'm personally very interested in is the role of peer exposure to neighborhood policing. So what does it mean not only to be exposed to policing yourself, but also to go to a class in which the students that are sitting around you are exposed to neighborhood policing in their own residential environment, and what are the effects of this kind of peer exposure to policing? Thank you very much, and with that, I'm looking forward to the comments from Professor Song, I believe, and also to all of your questions.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And the byproduct of a highly vigilant policing will be a negative impact on the educational performance is actually very startling result we are facing today. Is there any final comments you want to share for the students as time's running out? I just wanted to, this last moment for you to say something for our students and attendants in the conference.
I just want to say that I think this is a great time to study social science. And one of the reasons is, well, I think there are two important reasons. One is huge number of important social problems that we have the skills to work on and contribute to. And the second component is the increasing accessibility of these kind of large scale data sources that give us new opportunities to study these social problems and give many new opportunities that were not there 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And I think these are really two great reasons to be a social scientist today.
Thank you very much. With that remark, let's give him a big applause. Thank you very much for your time. It's late night in the evening, and thank you very much for the participant attendance to this talk, not only in the Zoom but also at YouTube. Thank you very much. Next, we're gonna have Professor Peter Bierman. Hopefully, I will see you again. Thank you very much, and thank you very much
Thank
for.
you.
Yeah, I forgot to
Thank you,
mention.
Dr. Doug.